Welcome to Mr. Keelin's Stories, my beautiful YouTube family, a place where every story comes to life. Here, we share powerful and emotional stories that touch the heart, reveal deep truths, and leave a lasting impact. Each story is crafted to make you feel, think, and connect on a deeper level. If you love storytelling that inspires and moves you, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment. Let's dive into a world of storytelling that captures the deepest emotions and unveils the hidden struggles of life. This is where love, sacrifice, and self-discovery come together, creating stories that challenge society and touch the heart. Each tale will make you feel, reflect, and understand the true meaning of acceptance and courage. The church bells rang through the crisp autumn air, their chimes echoing across Willow Creek. The town had gathered in St. Mary's Chapel, the oldest and most revered church in the area, to witness the union of two of its most beloved souls, Eleanor and Daniel Whitmore. Golden sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the polished wooden floors. The scent of fresh roses and white lilies filled the air, mingling with the soft whispers of the guests who had taken their seats. Everything was perfect, yet for Eleanor, perfection had never felt so unsettling. She stood at the church entrance, her ivory gown trailing behind her like a river of silk. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, a frantic rhythm that refused to slow. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the town's admiration, her family's pride, the envy of young girls dreaming of their own fairy tale weddings. But none of it mattered, because deep down, something felt wrong. Her father, Harold Hayes, stood beside her, his arm linked with hers. He squeezed her hand gently, sensing her unease. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the organ's soft melody. "Are you cold?" Eleanor swallowed, forcing a smile. "A little." It was a lie. Her father smiled, his weathered face filled with warmth. "Don't be nervous, sweetheart. Daniel is a good man." Eleanor nodded, but her fingers trembled against the bouquet of white roses she held. She had never doubted Daniel's kindness. He was everything a woman could hope for, handsome, respectful, and dependable. Then why did her stomach twist with unease? The grand wooden doors swung open, and the moment she had dreamed of for years arrived. She took her first step forward, the soft click of her heels against the floor, drowned by the gasp of the crowd. She could see their faces, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her bridesmaids smiling in admiration. The air buzzed with excitement, and then she saw him. Daniel Whitmore stood at the altar, waiting for her. Tall and elegant in his tailored black tuxedo, he looked every bit the perfect groom. His hair was neatly combed, his broad shoulders squared with confidence. A smile graced his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor's breath hitched. Something flickered behind his gaze, something unreadable. Was it fear, guilt, regret? Her steps faltered for just a fraction of a second, but her father's grip tightened around her hand, guiding her forward. "Keep going. Don't think." She reached the altar, her bouquet feeling heavier in her grasp. Daniel took her hands in his fingers slightly cold. "You look beautiful," he whispered, but there was tension in his voice. Eleanor tried to smile, but she could feel the distance between them, an invisible wall neither of them spoke about. The priest began the ceremony, his deep voice resonating through the church. Vows were exchanged, promises made. Yet as Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Eleanor noticed the way his hands trembled. Why is he shaking? She searched his face for answers, but his expression was carefully composed. When it was her turn to speak, her throat went dry. She forced the words out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do." The church erupted into cheers, the guests applauding, the organ playing a triumphant melody. Eleanor smiled for the cameras, posed for the guests, and let herself be wrapped in Daniel's arms as he kissed her. But as his lips touched hers, she felt nothing. No fire, no passion, just an unsettling emptiness. And in that moment, Eleanor knew she had just married a man with a secret. The cheers of the crowd felt distant, like an echo from another world. Eleanor's fingers tightened around Daniel's, searching for warmth, for reassurance. But all she found was an unfamiliar stiffness. His grip wasn't that of a man embracing his forever. It was hesitant, careful, like someone playing a role rather than living in the moment. As they turned to face the guests hand in hand, Eleanor's smile felt forced. The flashes of cameras lit up their faces, capturing what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. But beneath the surface of joy, a quiet storm brewed inside her. Daniel's family beamed with pride, but she caught a glimpse of his mother's face. Her smile was almost relieved, as if a burden had been lifted. Why? The weight of the diamond ring on her finger felt heavier than it should. It was meant to symbolize forever. Yet all Eleanor could think about was how fragile forever suddenly seemed. As they walked down the aisle together, flower petals raining over them, she stole one last glance at her new husband. His lips curved into a polite smile, his eyes filled with something unspoken. Eleanor had no idea what secret Daniel was hiding, but she knew one thing for certain. This was not the beginning of a love story. It was the beginning of a truth waiting to be uncovered. The grand ballroom of Willow Creek's finest hotel glittered with golden chandeliers and twinkling fairy lights. Laughter echoed through the high ceilings, the sound of clinking glasses filling the air as guests toasted to the newlyweds. The scent of vanilla and fresh roses intertwined with the aroma of exquisite cuisine, making the entire reception feel like a scene from a fairy tale. Eleanor sat at the head table, her pristine white gown cascading around her, the diamond ring on her finger catching the soft glow of candlelight. She was supposed to feel like the happiest woman in the world. This was her wedding night, the beginning of forever, with the man she had promised to love. But something was wrong. Daniel sat beside her, smiling at the guests, laughing at jokes, raising his glass when someone toasted to their love. He played his part flawlessly, too flawlessly. But Eleanor saw the cracks. He never reached for her hand unless necessary. He never leaned in to whisper sweet nothings. His smile, though charming to everyone else, lacked the warmth she longed for. She studied him carefully, her heart twisting. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his suit jacket. His jaw clenched ever so slightly whenever someone mentioned their future together. And the way he avoided looking into her eyes, like he was afraid of what he might find there. Then there was Ryan, a tall, striking man with dark eyes and an easy smile. He had been introduced as an old friend of Daniel's, but there was something about him that made Eleanor uneasy. She noticed how Daniel tensed whenever Ryan was near, how his laughter came a little too forced when they spoke. At one point, as Daniel stood by the bar, Ryan approached him. It was just for a moment, just a quiet exchange, but Eleanor saw it. The way Ryan's hand brushed Daniel's wrist, the way Daniel inhaled sharply before stepping away, the way their eyes lingered, something cold settled in Eleanor's stomach. But before she could process it, someone pulled her into a dance. Laughter and celebration carried on. Toasts were made. Cake was cut. To the outside world, it was a perfect wedding night. But for Eleanor, perfection had never felt so hollow. By the time the reception ended, Eleanor was exhausted. Physically, emotionally. She sat in the back of the vintage car as they were driven to the honeymoon suite at the hotel. Daniel sat beside her, his hands resting stiffly on his lap. The silence between them was suffocating. "You barely touched your cake," she finally said, forcing a small laugh. Daniel glanced at her, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I wasn't that hungry." The response felt empty. Eleanor looked out the window, watching the lights of the city blur past. This wasn't how she had imagined her wedding night. She had dreamed of whispered promises, of stolen kisses, of warmth and passion that made the world disappear. Instead, all she felt was distance. When they reached the hotel, the staff greeted them with excitement, showering them with petals as they made their way to the honeymoon suite. The room was breathtaking. White roses arranged on the table, champagne chilling in a silver bucket, a soft glow from the bedside lamps creating the perfect romantic atmosphere. Eleanor turned to Daniel, waiting for him to look at her, to pull her into his arms, to make her feel like his wife. But he walked past her, straight to the balcony. She stood frozen in place, watching as he loosened his tie and leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights. Her heart sank. "Daniel," she said softly, stepping closer. He flinched. It was so slight, so quick, but she saw it. A husband shouldn't flinch at the sound of his wife's voice. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. She had to push past this. Maybe it was just nerves, exhaustion from the long day. Maybe once they were alone, once they had a moment to breathe, everything would feel right again. She reached for him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Daniel stiffened. Not just stiffened, he recoiled. The rejection was like a slap to the face. Eleanor pulled back immediately, staring at him in shock. "Daniel?" He turned to her, running a hand through his hair. His eyes darted everywhere but at her. "I'm just tired," he murmured. "Just tired." She stared at him, searching his face for something, anything that would explain the way he was acting. Her husband, the man she had promised to love and cherish, the man who had vowed to be hers, and yet, in this moment, she felt like a stranger to him. A chill ran down her spine. "Daniel, if something's wrong, you can tell me." For a split second, something flashed across his face. Guilt? Pain? But then it was gone. "I just need some rest," he said, offering her a weak smile. "It's been a long day." Eleanor nodded slowly, even as her heart screamed that something wasn't right. She watched as he stepped away, unbuttoning his shirt and heading into the bathroom. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her standing alone in the middle of their honeymoon suite. The weight of the day, the weight of everything, suddenly crashed down on her. This wasn't how a wedding night was supposed to feel. This wasn't how love was supposed to feel. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the closed bathroom door, her fingers gripping the sheets. And for the first time that night, she let herself admit it. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the honeymoon suite, casting a soft golden glow over the room. The air smelled of fresh linens and faint traces of Eleanor's vanilla perfume. But despite the warmth of the morning, a strange chill lingered in her heart. She hadn't slept much. Daniel had fallen asleep almost instantly the night before, lying on his side, his back turned to her. Eleanor had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sound of his breathing, wondering why she felt so alone despite being inches away from her husband. She had told herself over and over that she was overthinking, that the exhaustion from the wedding had drained them both, that things would feel normal in the morning. But now morning was here, and the unease hadn't left. Eleanor slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Daniel. She walked to the small table near the window, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the hotel's silver carafe. The rich aroma filled the air, but even as she took a sip, she barely tasted it. She glanced back at the bed. Daniel was still asleep, his dark hair tousled, his breathing slow and steady. His phone lay on the nightstand beside him, screen facing up. Then it buzzed. A single notification lit up the screen. Eleanor hadn't meant to look. But her eyes instinctively flickered to it, and before she could stop herself, she read the message. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel. We need to talk." Her grip on the coffee cup tightened. The message was from a man named Ryan. Ryan. Her pulse quickened as memories of the previous night flooded back. Ryan's lingering glances, the way Daniel had tensed around him, the brief yet loaded exchange at the bar. Who was Ryan? And what exactly couldn't he do anymore? A strange heat crawled up Eleanor's spine. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't seen it. After all, it wasn't her place to go through her husband's phone. But a deeper part of her, the part still aching from Daniel's coldness last night, whispered that this was more than just an innocent message. Eleanor hesitated. Her heart warred between trust and suspicion. Then, as if fate was pushing her forward, the phone buzzed again. Another message from Ryan. "Please, Daniel, don't shut me out like this. You know what we had was real." The air left Eleanor's lungs. Her fingers trembled as she set the coffee cup down, her mind racing. What we had? A sharp pang stabbed at her chest, 1,000 unspoken fears colliding at once. She reached for the phone instinctively, but before she could touch it, Daniel stirred. She yanked her hand back as if burned. He groaned softly, stretching before blinking up at her. His sleepy eyes met hers, and for a moment he looked like the Daniel she had always known, gentle, warm, the man she had fallen in love with. But now she wasn't sure if she had ever truly known him at all. "Morning," he murmured, rubbing his face. Eleanor forced a smile, though her pulse pounded in her ears. "Morning." He glanced at the nightstand, reaching for his phone. Eleanor held her breath. The second he saw the messages, his entire body stiffened. She watched as his eyes darted over the words on the screen. His fingers clenched around the device, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then slowly, he locked the screen and set the phone down. No reaction, no explanation, just silence. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She had hoped, prayed, that he would say something, anything, to ease the tightness in her chest. But instead, he simply stood up, stretched, and walked toward the bathroom as if nothing had happened. The door clicked shut, and Eleanor was left alone with a cup of coffee gone cold, a husband who was hiding something, and a single, unanswered question pounding in her mind. Who was Ryan? The weight of Eleanor's suspicions had become unbearable. She had spent the entire day pretending nothing was wrong, smiling when she was supposed to, laughing at Daniel's weak attempts at conversation. But deep down, she felt like a woman living in someone else's story, a story where she was never meant to be the heroine. She had married a man who had kept a part of himself hidden from her, and now she needed to know the truth. That evening, as they returned to their honeymoon suite, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Daniel had been distant, checking his phone when he thought she wasn't looking, giving her half-hearted smiles that never quite reached his eyes. The warmth that newlyweds were supposed to share was missing. Eleanor knew she wasn't imagining it anymore. Something was missing between them, something Daniel had never been able to give her. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching him move around the room. He seemed restless, as if he was avoiding looking at her for too long. "I'm going to take a shower," he muttered, grabbing a towel from the rack. Eleanor nodded, offering him a tight smile. "Okay." The moment the bathroom door clicked shut, her heart pounded. Her gaze darted to his phone, resting on the nightstand. She hesitated. Every part of her wanted to trust him, to believe that whatever she was feeling was just the paranoia of a newlywed, adjusting to married life. But then she remembered the message. "Please, Daniel, don't shut me out like this. You know what we had was real." Something inside her cracked. With shaky hands, she reached for the phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, a wave of guilt washing over her. This was a violation of trust, but had Daniel ever truly trusted her in the first place? Taking a deep breath, she unlocked it. Her heart stopped. Hundreds of messages. Not just casual texts, messages filled with longing, with secrets, with a love that had never belonged to her. She scrolled, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Ryan, I miss you. Every second of this is killing me. Daniel, I don't know what to do. I never wanted to hurt you, but I had no choice." "Ryan, you had a choice, Daniel. You chose her." Her vision blurred. With trembling fingers, she scrolled further. The texts spanned months, maybe even years. Late-night confessions, unsent drafts, memories captured in typed words. Ryan wasn't just someone from Daniel's past. He was someone Daniel loved in a way he had never loved her. Tears stung her eyes, but she couldn't stop reading. "Ryan, tell me one thing, Daniel. When you kiss her, do you think of me? Daniel, I can't do this. It's not fair to her. It's not fair to you. Ryan, then tell me why you're still lying to yourself." Eleanor's breath hitched. The walls around her shattered. Every kiss that had felt empty, every touch that had been hesitant, every time she had felt more like a responsibility than a desire. She had spent so long questioning herself, wondering if she wasn't beautiful enough, if she wasn't enough for him. But the truth had nothing to do with her. Daniel had never been in love with her, because Daniel was in love with someone else. The sound of water running in the bathroom was the only thing grounding her to the present. She gripped the phone, her chest rising and falling with shaky breaths. Her marriage was a lie. Her future had been stolen before it had even begun. And worst of all, Daniel had never been able to choose her, because his heart had never belonged to her in the first place. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside the window. The warm glow of the bedside lamp barely touched the coldness settling inside Eleanor. She stood motionless, Daniel's phone clutched in her trembling hands, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The messages still glowed on the screen, the weight of them crushing her chest. "I love him." "You had a choice, Daniel. You chose her. Do you think of me when you kiss her?" Her stomach twisted. The water in the bathroom stopped running. Eleanor's breath hitched. She forced herself to stay still, to push away the tears pricking at her eyes. She couldn't cry. Not yet. Not now. The door handle turned. A moment later, Daniel stepped out, running a towel through his damp hair. He wore a white t-shirt and loose sweatpants, looking relaxed, almost unaware that his entire world was about to break apart. But then he saw her, standing by the bed, holding his phone. His body went rigid, the color drained from his face, his expression shifting from surprise to something far worse, fear. "Eleanor." His voice cracked as he took a hesitant step forward. She swallowed the lump in her throat, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Who is Ryan?" The question sliced through the air like a blade. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Eleanor forced herself to hold his gaze. She needed to see it. She needed to hear it. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet stronger than she ever thought possible. "I deserve that much." Daniel's breath shuddered. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He looked like a man drowning, a man whose secrets were finally catching up to him. His lips parted, but no words came out. She took a step closer, lifting the phone slightly. "I read them, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking. "I read everything." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, inhaling sharply. His entire body seemed to tremble as he ran a hand down his face, as if trying to wipe away the inevitable. When he finally looked at her again, tears welled in his eyes. "I love him," he whispered. The words hit Eleanor like a slap. Her breath caught in her throat. The room spun around her, the walls closing in. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't speak. She had known. Somewhere deep down, she had known for a long time. But hearing it, hearing him say it out loud, made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. Her knees felt weak. Her wedding ring, so bright, so perfect, felt like a chain around her finger. She let out a shaky breath. "Since when?" Daniel hesitated. "Eleanor, Since when, Daniel?" she snapped, her voice breaking under the weight of everything. "How long have you been lying to me?" He flinched. A war raged behind his eyes. Shame, regret, pain, but no amount of guilt could erase what he had done. "Since before I met you," he admitted, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the air between them. Eleanor's stomach lurched. Before he met her. Her entire life with him had been built on a lie. "Then why?" Her voice cracked as she took a step back. "Why marry me? Why put me through this?" Daniel's breath shuddered, his eyes red-rimmed. "Because I was scared." She let out a hollow laugh, bitter and broken. "Scared of what?" "Of being who I am," he whispered. "Of disappointing my family, of losing everything. I thought if I married you, I could—" He stopped himself, running a shaky hand through his hair. "I thought I could make it go away." Eleanor let out a sharp breath, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Make what go away?" His voice cracked. "This part of me," he admitted, finally looking at her, broken and raw. "The part that's always loved him." Eleanor covered her mouth, a sob escaping before she could stop it. She had imagined 1,000 reasons for why Daniel had been distant, why their love had always felt incomplete, but never in her worst nightmares had she imagined this. "Do you even love me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Daniel's face crumpled. "I do," he said, stepping closer. "Just not in the way you deserve." She let out another broken laugh, shaking her head as more tears fell. "Not in the way any wife deserves." "I never wanted to hurt you," Daniel whispered. Eleanor wiped her face, her fingers trembling. "But you did." Silence. Daniel dropped his head, his own tears slipping down his face. He had nothing left to say. The truth had finally been spoken. And now there was no going back. The air in the room felt heavier than ever before, thick with the weight of unspoken truths and shattered dreams. The soft hum of the city outside their hotel suite seemed distant, almost non-existent, compared to the silence that stretched between them. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his hands tangled in his damp hair, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had lost everything, but Eleanor knew. She was the one who had truly lost the life she thought she had, lost the love she had believed in, lost the future she had planned. "I never wanted to hurt you," Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse, barely able to meet her gaze. "I tried to be what everyone expected. My family, this town. They wouldn't accept the truth." Eleanor let out a shaky breath, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold the pieces of her breaking heart together. She had spent years believing in this love, trusting in it. But now she wasn't sure what had been real and what had been a lie. "So I was just a cover." Her voice wavered, a mix of pain, betrayal, and disbelief. Daniel's head shot up, his eyes filled with raw emotion. "No," he said quickly. "No, Eleanor. You were never just that." She stared at him, waiting, needing to hear something that would make this hurt less. But she wasn't sure anything could. Daniel's lips parted, as if he was searching for the right words, the ones that would soften the wound, but there were none. His hands clenched on his lap, his knuckles white. "You are my best friend," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I love you, just not the way a husband should." The words hung between them like a blade, sharp and final. Eleanor felt something inside her crack. She turned away, blinking back the tears that burned her eyes. "That's not love, Daniel," she whispered. "At least, not the kind I needed from you." Daniel inhaled sharply, as if the reality of what he had done was finally crushing him. "I know," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. Eleanor pressed a hand against her chest, where her heart ached so deeply she thought it might never heal. She had given him everything, her trust, her devotion, her dreams of forever, and he had given her a lie, a beautifully crafted, carefully maintained lie. "You let me build my whole life around something that was never real," she whispered. "You let me believe I was enough." Daniel's breath hitched, and suddenly he was on his feet, his hands reaching out like he could somehow fix the damage. "You are enough, Eleanor," he pleaded. "You were always enough. It's me. I was never enough for you." She flinched at his touch, stepping back. "Don't," she said, shaking her head. "Don't try to make this about you. I needed a husband, Daniel, someone who wanted me, who saw me, and you were never really here." Daniel's face crumpled. He looked like he wanted to argue, to defend himself. But what could he say? Every excuse, every justification would only hurt her more. He had stolen something from her, years of her life, the chance to find someone who truly loved her, the right to choose the truth over a lie. And for what? To protect his own secret? To live a life that would never make him happy? "You should have told me," Eleanor murmured, her voice raw, "before the wedding, before any of this." Daniel wiped at his face, but the tears kept coming. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't want to lose you." Eleanor's breath caught. "But you never really had me, did you?" Daniel froze. The truth had finally been spoken. And for the first time, Eleanor saw the full weight of his guilt crash down on him. She had been his shield, his way of pretending to the world, his way of making himself believe he could be something he wasn't. But in doing so, he had taken away her ability to find someone who truly loved her. She shook her head, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. "You didn't just break my heart, Daniel. You stole my chance to be loved the way I deserve." A sob escaped his lips. "I know," he whispered, "and I will never forgive myself for it." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the tears finally fall. She had spent so long loving a man who had never been able to love her back. And now, for the first time, she saw the truth for what it really was. Their love had been a lie. Their life had been built on sand. And now it was all crumbling down. The room was suffocatingly silent, broken only by the distant hum of city life outside their window. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the walls, mirroring the darkness settling in Eleanor's heart. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped together in her lap, her mind racing. She thought of Willow Creek, the small town where she had grown up, where everyone knew everyone, where the churches were always full and secrets had no place to hide. She thought of the women at the local bakery, who whispered behind their hands when someone stepped out of line. She thought of the fathers who raised their sons to be strong, to be leaders, to never show weakness. And she thought of the mothers who told their daughters that marriage was everything, that a woman's greatest achievement was to be a wife, a mother, the keeper of a perfect home. Willow Creek didn't tolerate different. She let out a shuddering breath, turning to look at Daniel, who was standing near the window, staring out into the night. His back was tense, his arms wrapped around himself as if he was trying to hold himself together. "You were willing to live a lie. Forever?" Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaling deeply before turning to face her. "I thought I could make it work," he admitted. His voice was hoarse, heavy with the weight of years of fear, of hiding. "I thought maybe if I married you, I could change." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "But love doesn't work that way." Daniel gave her a broken smile. Number it doesn't. She studied him, the man she had loved, the man she had promised to spend forever with. And yet, standing there in front of her, he looked like a stranger. Or maybe, for the first time, he was himself. Eleanor thought of all the moments that had seemed off in their relationship. The way he had never truly looked at her, the way a man in love should. The way his kisses had always felt hollow. The way he had hesitated every time she had tried to plan their future together. And now she understood. It wasn't because he didn't love her. It was because he couldn't. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Did you ever think about what this would do to me?" Daniel's face crumpled. "Of course I did," he whispered. "Every single day." Her throat burned with emotion. "Then why? Why did you go through with it?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Because I was a coward, Eleanor. Because I was afraid." She clenched her fists. "Afraid of what?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "Of losing everything." Eleanor's breath hitched. She knew exactly what he meant. In Willow Creek, being different wasn't an option. People who were different were cast aside. Boys who weren't manly enough were mocked. Girls who didn't follow the rules were shamed. Families whispered behind closed doors about people who didn't fit into the perfect little mold the town had created. And being gay, that was a secret you took to your grave. Daniel ran a hand down his face, his voice barely above a whisper. "If my parents knew the truth, if the town knew—" He swallowed hard. "I would lose everything, Eleanor. My family, my business, my place in this world." Eleanor's heart twisted. She thought of Daniel's parents, his father, a respected businessman, his mother, the head of every church event. They had raised him to be perfect, to be the ideal son, the golden boy of Willow Creek. They would never accept the truth, and Daniel had spent his whole life hiding because of it. Eleanor's anger wavered, replaced by something softer, something sadder. She had spent years dreaming of the perfect love story. Daniel had spent years running from himself. She wiped at her tears. "So you chose to sacrifice my happiness instead?" Daniel flinched as if she had slapped him. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted. "I thought maybe I could love you enough. Maybe I could be the man you deserved." Eleanor let out a choked laugh, shaking her head. "But you couldn't." His eyes filled with tears. "No." A painful silence stretched between them. Daniel clenched his jaw, his voice breaking. "I wanted so badly to be normal, Eleanor." Her breath caught. She saw it then. The pain, the guilt, the years of pretending, of forcing himself to be someone he wasn't. He wasn't just afraid of losing his family. He was afraid of losing himself. Tears slid down Eleanor's cheeks. She had been so angry, so betrayed, but now, as she looked at him, all she felt was sorrow. Not just for herself, but for him. For the boy who had grown up believing he was wrong. For the man who had been forced to lie to survive. For the friend who had been too afraid to tell her the truth. She exhaled shakily. "Daniel, I don't hate you." His eyes widened, his lips parting in shock. "You don't?" She shook her head. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I don't hate you." Daniel let out a breath, one filled with years of pain, of secrets, of loneliness. Eleanor stood up, wiping her face. This wasn't the ending she had planned for her love story, but maybe. This wasn't her ending at all. The morning sun spilled through the stained glass windows of Willow Creek Church, painting the pews in vibrant hues of blue, red, and gold. The air inside was warm, filled with laughter and chatter. Daniel's parents were at the front, surrounded by well-wishers, their faces glowing with pride. Their son, their perfect boy, had finally settled down with a respectable woman. The whispers of admiration floated through the air. "Such a beautiful couple. They'll have the most gorgeous children." A match made in heaven. Eleanor walked through the church doors, her heels clicking against the polished wooden floor. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she kept walking, kept moving forward. Because this time, she wasn't just walking for herself. She was walking for him, for Daniel, for the truth. The moment she stepped inside, the conversation quieted. Heads turned. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring. She wasn't glowing with post-marital bliss. Instead, she stood tall, her hands trembling at her sides, her heart pounding in her chest. At the front of the room, Daniel's mother, Margaret Whitmore, caught sight of her. Her smile faltered. "Eleanor, dear, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be off on your honeymoon?" Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. She glanced toward Daniel, who stood frozen near the altar, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. She had given him the chance to tell them last night. He had begged for time, but she knew time was a luxury they no longer had. This lie had lasted long enough, and she refused to be part of it anymore. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The entire room seemed to lean in, waiting for her next words. "This marriage is over." A collective gasp filled the church. Margaret's face twisted in confusion, then horror. "What nonsense are you saying?" She reached out, gripping Eleanor's arm as if she could physically hold the marriage together. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't falter. Instead, she turned toward Daniel and held out her hand. His breath hitched. His entire body was trembling. "Tell them, Daniel," she whispered. "Tell them the truth." His parents, his friends, his community, all eyes were on him now, waiting, watching. Daniel's lips trembled. His gaze flickered between Eleanor and the sea of familiar faces, the people he had spent his entire life pleasing, molding himself to fit their expectations. His father, Gerald Whitmore, stood up from the pew, his face darkening. "Son?" Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His entire world had been built on this moment, on the fear of it, on the denial of it. And now he stood on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump. For the first time in his life, he took Eleanor's hand. Not as a husband, not as a man hiding behind a lie, but as her friend. He squeezed her fingers just for a second, gathering strength. Then he lifted his head and spoke the truth. "I'm gay." Silence, heavy, deafening, unforgiving. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Gerald's face turned red, his jaw clenching so tight it looked painful. Someone in the back gasped aloud. A woman whispered, "Dear God." A man muttered, "Is this a joke?" But Daniel didn't take it back. He didn't laugh it off, didn't make excuses. For the first time in his life, he didn't run from who he was. His chest rose and fell in quick breaths, but his voice didn't waver as he continued. "I'm gay," he repeated, "and I've been lying to myself, and to all of you, for years. I married Eleanor thinking I could change, thinking I could be the son you wanted, the husband she deserved, but I can't." Eleanor's grip tightened around his hand, grounding him, and then chaos. Margaret shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No," she whispered. "No, Daniel, don't say that. You don't mean it." Gerald slammed his fist against the back of a pew. "Enough!" His voice was sharp, cold. "We will discuss this at home." Daniel turned to his father, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "I won't go home," he said softly. "Not if home means pretending to be someone I'm not." Gasps. More whispers. Margaret sobbed. "This isn't you." Daniel closed his eyes. "Mom, it is." A woman, Mrs. Calloway, the town baker, shook her head. "I can't believe this. Eleanor, you poor thing." Eleanor turned to her, her expression firm. "I am not the victim here." More silence, more shock, because that was what they were all thinking, wasn't it? Poor Eleanor, the abandoned wife, the woman whose husband never loved her. But they were wrong, because Eleanor wasn't broken, she wasn't abandoned, She was free. She lifted her chin, her voice clear, unwavering. The only thing tragic about this situation is that Daniel felt he had to hide who he was. She turned back to her husband, her best friend, and smiled. A real smile. But he doesn't have to anymore. Daniel's breath hitched. His eyes filled with something more powerful than fear. Relief. For the first time in his life, he was free. The crowd exploded with noise, some shouting in anger, others crying, a few sitting in stunned silence. But none of it mattered, because in that moment Daniel was finally honest, and Eleanor finally took back her life. The church erupted. Gasps turned into murmurs. Murmurs turned into whispers. Whispers turned into full-blown shouts. Weight of the truth had shattered the perfect illusion of Willow Creek, and the people didn't know what to do with the broken pieces. "Unbelievable," someone scoffed. "This is a disgrace," an older woman hissed, clutching her pearls like she was witnessing something sinful. Daniel stood frozen at the front of the church, his hands shaking, his heart pounding against his ribs. His mother wept into her hands. His father stood stiff and silent, his face like carved stone. Eleanor felt the weight of all those eyes, piercing, judging, condemning, but she didn't shrink back. She stood taller. Daniel had done what they said he never could. He had spoken his truth. And now the town had a choice. Accept him or cast him aside. And then the church doors creaked open. A shadow stretched across the floor as Ryan stepped inside. A stunned hush fell over the crowd. Daniel inhaled sharply, his entire body locking up as he turned to face the man who had held his heart for years in secret. Ryan stood at the entrance, his chest rising and falling with nervous breaths. His dark eyes flickered across the sea of stunned faces before settling on Daniel, just Daniel. His expression was a mix of fear and love, a deep, aching kind of love that had been buried, hidden, denied, until now. Eleanor felt her throat tighten as she turned to Daniel. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear of stepping forward, of taking the final step into the light. He had spoken the truth, but speaking was one thing, living it was another. Eleanor reached for his hand one last time, not as a wife, not as a lover, but as his friend. "Go to him," she whispered. Daniel's breath caught. He hesitated. Then he ran. The collective gasp from the crowd was deafening as Daniel rushed down the aisle, his polished dress shoes thudding against the church floor. Ryan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Not until Daniel reached him, not until Daniel stood before him, his face open, raw, terrified, but free. Ryan's hands trembled at his sides. "Are you sure?" he whispered, voice hoarse. Daniel nodded. For the first time in his life, he was completely sure. The weight of expectations, of fear, of secrecy, it all fell away. And then, before the entire town, before the people who had tried to keep him trapped in a life that wasn't his, Daniel took Ryan's hand. The church exploded into chaos. Margaret let out a strangled sob, her knees buckling as Gerald caught her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." "Shameful," an elderly man spat. "Daniel, don't do this," someone yelled. But then something else happened. A single voice cut through the noise. "It's about damn time." Every head turned to see old Mr. Harris, the town's retired librarian, standing near the back, arms crossed, a small, knowing smile on his wrinkled face. Then another voice. "If this is love, then who are we to judge?" Mrs. Thompson, the woman who ran the flower shop. And then another, "Love is love." The words came from the most unexpected person, Reverend Clark. The same man who had presided over Daniel and Eleanor's wedding the day before now stood from his pew, looking out at the town he had guided for decades. "I have spent my life preaching about truth," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "And today, a man has spoken his truth, a truth that should never have had to be hidden." Silence, deep, heavy, uncertain. Willow Creek was a town of tradition, of small minds and whispered judgments, but it was also a town of people, people who, maybe, just maybe, could change. Not all of them, not yet. Some still glared, some still fumed, some still refused to look at Daniel at all. But some were listening, and sometimes that was enough. Eleanor exhaled, her heart aching but full. This wasn't the love story she had planned, but it was the one that needed to be told. The afternoon sun was setting as Eleanor walked away from Willow Creek Church, her heels clicking against the pavement, her heart heavy but light at the same time. She had walked into that church as a wife, a bride still trapped in the illusion of love. She was leaving as something else entirely, a woman reborn. Her heart ached, of course it did. How could it not? She had dreamed of a life with Daniel. She had imagined anniversaries, children, growing old together. She had pictured a love that could stand the test of time. But love should never be a prison. And the hardest thing she had ever done was set someone free. In the weeks that followed, the town was split in two. Some people whispered behind closed doors, their words sharp and cruel, disgusting, unnatural. His poor parents, they raised him better than this. But others whispered something different. Did you see the way he looked at Ryan? That was love. Maybe we had it wrong all along. The town didn't change overnight. People still gossiped. People still judged. People still held on to their old ways. But something had shifted, because now, for the first time, the conversation had started. And sometimes that was how change began. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Eleanor sat by her window, a cup of tea in her hands, when a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar. Daniel. Her fingers trembled as she carefully tore it open. Dear Eleanor, I've started this letter 1,000 times, but I never knew how to put my gratitude into words. I still don't, but I have to try. I am free. Ryan and I left Willow Creek. We live in a city now, a place where I don't have to look over my shoulder before I reach for the hand of the man I love. A place where no one cares if I kiss him in the middle of the street. I never knew life could feel this light. But I wouldn't be here without you. I need you to know this. You saved me, Eleanor. You could have hated me. You could have let anger and betrayal harden your heart, but instead you did the bravest thing I've ever seen. You let me go. And because of that, I finally found myself. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you for that, but I hope, wherever you are happy. You deserve a love that is whole, a love that chooses you. Forever grateful, Daniel, tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she read the letter, her fingers gripping the paper as if she could somehow hold on to the moment forever. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel everything. The pain, the loss, the relief, the love, a different kind of love, one that wasn't romantic but was just as profound. She thought of Daniel. No, not the Daniel she had married, the real Daniel, the one who finally didn't have to pretend. And she smiled, because this was love, not the kind she had expected. Not the kind she had planned for, but a love that had changed them both. And that was enough. That was everything. Eleanor stood outside the church, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The whispers and gasps still echoed in her mind, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had done the right thing, not just for herself, but for Daniel, for Ryan, and for anyone who had ever been forced to hide their true self. Inside, Daniel was still standing at the altar, his hands shaking, his heart pounding. He had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable. His mother's face was frozen in shock. His father looked away in disappointment, and the guests were divided, some in silent judgment, others in quiet support. Then Ryan stepped forward. He had been waiting outside, uncertain if he should come in, but now there was no more hiding. He walked past the stairs, past the whispers, until he reached Daniel. He looked into his eyes, searching for fear, for regret. But instead, he saw relief. Daniel took a deep breath and reached for Ryan's hand. For the first time in his life, he wasn't pretending. Eleanor watched from a distance, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from something else. Freedom. She had lost a husband, but she had helped a friend find himself. And in a way, she had found herself too. The town of Willow Creek wouldn't change overnight. Some people would never understand, never accept, but others would. And change always started somewhere. As weeks passed, Eleanor found herself walking through town, hearing the murmurs of those who still gossiped about that day. She didn't care. She was stronger now. She had survived heartbreak and come out of it with a new sense of purpose. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. "I don't have the right words to thank you. You gave me the strength to be who I am. Ryan and I have moved to the city where we can finally live without fear. It's not easy, but for the first time, I am truly happy. None of this would have been possible without you. You showed me what real love is. Not possession, not obligation, but the courage to set someone free. I hope you find happiness too. You deserve it more than anyone. With all my gratitude, Daniel." Eleanor held the letter close to her chest, letting the words sink in. She had spent weeks replaying everything in her mind, the wedding, the revelation, the looks of shock and betrayal from the guests. But now, reading Daniel's words, she realized something. She wasn't a victim of this story. She was its hero. She had freed both of them from a lifetime of pretending. As she walked through Willow Creek, she could still feel the weight of the town's judgmental eyes. Some people nodded politely, some averted their gaze, and others whispered as she passed. She knew what they were saying. Poor Eleanor. She was humiliated, left on her wedding day. But she wasn't humiliated. She wasn't left behind. She had chosen to walk away with her dignity, with her heart intact. One evening, she sat on the porch of her childhood home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Her mother, who had been her pillar of strength throughout the ordeal, sat beside her, handing her a cup of tea. "You did a brave thing, sweetheart," her mother said softly. Eleanor sighed. It didn't feel brave at the time. It just felt necessary. Her mother smiled knowingly. "That's how courage works. It doesn't feel like a choice. It just feels like the only thing you can do." Eleanor looked down at the letter again. She pictured Daniel and Ryan, finally free to love without fear. She imagined Daniel smiling, really smiling, for the first time in his life. She had lost a marriage, but she had gained something much more valuable, the truth. Days turned into weeks, and gradually the whispers around town softened. Some people still clung to their prejudices, but others had changed. A local cafe owner, who had been one of the loudest voices of disapproval, surprised Eleanor by stopping her one day. "I was wrong about what I said at your wedding," he admitted. "Took me some time, but I see it now. Love isn't something you can force to fit an idea." Eleanor gave him a small, knowing smile. "No, it's not." Change was slow, but it was happening. Months later, as she stood by the lake where she and Daniel had once dreamed about their futures, she felt something new, a sense of peace. She had no regrets. A soft breeze carried the sound of laughter from a nearby dock. She turned and saw a man standing there, smiling as he skipped stones across the water. He glanced at her, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something stir in her heart. Maybe her own love story hadn't ended. Maybe it was just beginning. She took a deep breath, let go of the past, and walked forward, toward whatever was waiting for her next. As Eleanor stepped closer to the lake, she felt lighter than she had in months. The burden of the past was no longer weighing her down. She had learned that love wasn't about fitting into society's mold. It was about honesty, about setting each other free. The man by the dock noticed her approaching and smiled warmly. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said. Eleanor nodded, returning the smile. "It really is." For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking back. She was ready for whatever came next. Because love, true love, wasn't something you forced. It was something you found when the time was right. Love is often painted as a fairy tale, perfect, effortless, and meant to follow a set path. But real love, honest love, doesn't always fit into the expectations of society. Eleanor and Daniel's story teaches us that sometimes love is not about holding on. It's about letting go. Eleanor could have stayed in a marriage built on falsehood, pretending everything was fine. She could have silenced her doubts, ignored the pain in Daniel's eyes, and lived the life that was expected of her. But love is not about appearances. Love is not about pretending. Daniel, too, could have continued to suppress his truth, fearing rejection from his family, his town, and even himself. He tried for years to become the man society told him he had to be, but love cannot thrive in fear. Love cannot exist in a cage. This story is a lesson in courage, the courage to be honest, even when the truth is painful. Eleanor lost a husband, but she gained her freedom. Daniel risked everything, but he found the love he had always been too afraid to embrace. Their journey reminds us that love should never be a prison. No one should have to sacrifice their identity to be accepted. True love is built on honesty, on mutual respect, and on the willingness to set each other free when necessary. The town of Willow Creek was slow to change, just like the world often is. There were those who judged, who gossiped, who refused to accept the truth, but there were also those who opened their hearts, who learned, who grew. Change does not happen overnight, but it begins with a single act of bravery. Eleanor and Daniel's story is a reflection of so many real stories, of people forced to hide who they truly are, of marriages built on pressure rather than passion, of individuals trapped by the expectations of their communities. But it also offers hope. It shows that there is life beyond fear, that there is love beyond societal norms, and that the bravest thing one can do is choose authenticity. At its core, this story is about love in its purest form. Not romantic love, but the kind of love that sets people free. Eleanor and Daniel were never meant to be husband and wife, but they were always meant to be a part of each other's lives. They found a different kind of love, a love that allowed them to walk separate paths, yet remain connected in understanding and respect. The lesson is clear. Love should never be forced. Love should never be a lie. Love should be freeing, not confining. And above all, love should be true. Love is not a chain, it is the wind beneath our wings. It should never confine, never silence, never force us to be someone we're not. True love is honest, raw, and fearless, even when the truth shakes the world around us. Eleanor and Daniel's story is not one of betrayal, but of liberation. It is proof that love is not just about romance. It's about courage, about setting each other free when the heart demands it. Real love doesn't fit into a mold. It doesn't bow to fear or tradition. It demands truth, no matter how painful, because only in truth can we find happiness, and only in freedom can we find love that lasts. She had learned that love wasn't about fitting into society's mold. It was about honesty, about setting each other free. The man by the dock noticed her approaching and smiled warmly. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said. Eleanor nodded, returning the smile. "It really is." For the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking back. She was ready for whatever came next, because love, true love, wasn't something you forced. It was something you found when the time was right. Love is often painted as a fairy tale, perfect, effortless, and meant to follow a set path. But real love, honest love, doesn't always fit into the expectations of society. Eleanor and Daniel's story teaches us that sometimes love is not about holding on, it's about letting go. Eleanor could have stayed in a marriage built on falsehood, pretending everything was fine. She could have silenced her doubts, ignored the pain in Daniel's eyes, and lived the life that was expected of her. But love is not about appearances. Love is not about pretending. Daniel, too, could have continued to suppress his truth, fearing rejection from his family, his town, and even himself. He tried for years to become the man society told him he had to be. But love cannot thrive in fear. Love cannot exist in a cage. This story is a lesson in courage, the courage to be honest, even when the truth is painful. Because only in truth can we find happiness, and only in freedom can we find love that lasts. Love is not just about holding hands and walking into the sunset. It is about standing in the storm and choosing honesty, even when it hurts. Eleanor and Daniel's story is not one of tragedy, but of transformation. It is a reminder that love is not about ownership. It is about understanding, respect, and the bravery to let go when necessary. Too often society tries to dictate what love should look like. It forces people into roles they were never meant to play, into relationships that suffocate rather than nurture. But love is not something that can be molded to fit expectations. It is wild, free, and untamed. It belongs to the heart, not to tradition. Eleanor could have stayed in her marriage, pretending everything was perfect. Daniel could have continued hiding, living a lie just to satisfy the world. But that would not have been love. It would have been imprisonment. Instead, they chose courage. They chose truth. And in doing so, they set themselves free. This story teaches us that love is not always about staying. It is sometimes about walking away with grace. It is about choosing self-respect over societal approval, about understanding that forcing love where it doesn't exist only leads to heartbreak. Eleanor lost a husband, but she gained something far more precious, her dignity, her strength, and her ability to love herself enough to let go. Daniel, too, found his own freedom. He learned that love should never be a secret, never be hidden in shame. He realized that his happiness mattered, that he deserved to be loved for who he truly was, not for who the world wanted him to be. And what about the town of Willow Creek? Change is slow, but it starts with one act of bravery. Some people whispered, others judged, but there were those who listened, who learned, who grew. Love has the power to change hearts, even if it takes time. This story is a reflection of so many real lives, of people forced to live behind masks, of love stories built on fear rather than truth. But it also offers hope. It reminds us that honesty is the foundation of real love, and that the bravest thing we can do is embrace who we are, unapologetically. In the end, love is not about following a script. It is about writing our own story. Love is not about fitting in. It is about breaking free. And the greatest love of all? It is the kind that allows us to be ourselves, without fear, without shame, without compromise.